There was a time when royal weddings were a private affair only, a polite ritual to which television cameras and journalists had no access. But the history books tell many interesting anecdotes about these ceremonies, which in most cases had nothing to do with love. Most royal couples met only at the wedding ceremony. Then they would leave for their wedding night. But as we can imagine, some nuptials ended in the worst way. With that in mind, we have listed some of the worst royal wedding nights in history. We start the video with the wedding night of Catherine the Great and Peter III of Russia. The wedding of Catherine the Great to Peter III of Russia was a splendid event. The bride, who came from Germany to marry the unpleasant Russian heir, charmed everyone present with her beauty, elegance, and adaptation to Russian life. Empress Elizabeth of Russia had hopes for her, for she did not trust her nephew, whom she considered lazy, a drunkard, a womanizer, and brainless. Catherine's disillusionment emerged on her wedding night when she waited hours for her new husband. Peter finally appeared drunk, lay down beside her, and fell asleep. The following nights were terrifying. At 18, Peter was insensitive to his wife's beauty and preferred to amuse himself with little wooden soldiers, miniature cannons, and models of fortresses. During the day, these toys were hidden under the bed. But after the dinner, when the couple went to bed, the bedroom door was closed and the fun began. Lying next to Catherine, Peter's eyes would sparkle when it was time to play, and sometimes this would last until 2 in the morning. Henry IV was King of Castile and brother of Isabella of Castile, the queen who unified the Kingdom of Spain with Ferdinand of Aragon. The king was kind and gentle, but he had serious physical problems. Henry suffered from a form of acromegaly, or gigantism. His hands and feet were too large. His head was abnormally large, with gross features, plus he was very tall. In short, he was an amiable and intimidating giant, oppressed by physical defects, and only happy when away from the public eye. Throughout his life, he had little contact with his half-brothers. Henry was first married at the age of 15 to Blanca of Navarre. They stayed together for 13 years, but without producing an heir. The marriage was annulled. Without the consummation of the first marriage, a second marriage was arranged for Henry. His new wife was another Iberian princess, JOAN of Portugal. JOAN was 16 years old and remarkably beautiful. Like other European princesses, she was only a bargaining chip to seal the alliance with her brother King Alfonso V. Interestingly, before she was married, the king abolished a law that made the wedding night a public spectacle, perhaps foreseeing what would happen. According to reports, the couple's first night was not a good one. The king's sperm was corroded. The doctors had to masturbate Henry IV with their bare hands. The result was considered watery and sterile, despite the attempt at artificial insemination. A thin gold tube was inserted into JOAN with the sperm her husband had produced. The goal was for JOAN to receive her husband's sperm, but JOAN failed to, said the German doctor who traveled to Castile to do the procedure. Despite the failure, this was the first recorded attempt at human artificial insemination in history. Henry's problems were enough to give rise to a cruel nickname, which also became a metaphor for his kingdom. Henry became known as the Impotent, and his wedding night with JOAN was a horror. British royalty is an environment ripe for unhappy marriages. Charles II is associated with 56 bastards. Edward VII frequented brothels assiduously, and everyone remembers what happened with the wedding of Charles and Diana. But one union failed right on the wedding night, that of Caroline of Brunswick with King George IV. The then Prince of Wales doggedly resisted finding a wife and only accepted when Parliament agreed to pay his debts, which had grown out of a life marked by lauderdom addiction and prostitution. The courtiers advised him to marry his cousin Caroline of Brunswick. At the time, she had a provincial life in her parents' principality. He had only seen her face in family portraits. The couple met 3 days before the wedding, and the first impression could not have been worse. George went to the other end of the palace and recovered with a glass cognac. Caroline said that her future husband was fatter and not as handsome as he had been painted. The marriage took place on April 8, 1795. George confessed in his two witnesses that he was marrying against his own will. According to chroniclers, he fainted twice during the ceremony. He also reportedly looked at one of his mistresses while taking his vows, who wept when the archbishop asked if anyone had any objections to the marriage. Sure, the marriage was consummated, but they had a terrible wedding night. The drunk groom spent the night warming himself by the fireplace, and the bride waited for him in bed, and nothing else. The newspapers of the time said that there were only 3 sexual relations between the bride and groom, one of which gave birth to Princess Charlotte Augusta. And after that, George announced that he would never sleep with his wife again, not even to beget a new heir. For many years, sex was one of the biggest taboos in Western society. This led to numerous embarrassing and traumatic situations, such as that experienced by Maria Josepha Amalia of Sajonia on the night of her marriage to the Spanish King Ferdinand VII. Ferdinand VII's third marriage was to Maria Josepha Amalia, a young girl who had not yet turned 16 when she was officially united to the Spanish king in 1819. After the death of her mother, the girl was raised in a convent. Her knowledge of carnal relationships was non-existent. On the other hand, the monarch was known for his sexual outbursts, in addition to his obsession with begetting a male child that would ensure the continuity of the monarchy. At that time, before the wedding night began, the blood princess, already married and familiarly closer to the king, used to spend 15 minutes with the bride, explaining what would happen next. But when the time came, the king's sister-in-law Maria Teresa de Braganza refused to perform that role because she was the sister of Isabel de Braganza, Ferdinand's former wife. In the absence of the princess, the function was to be performed by the eldest maid of honor, but she also refused, claiming that she had never noticed the things her husband did with her in bed. It was the king who explained what would happen that night in that room. The king entered the chambers of a frightened 16-year-old girl. She, seeing him fat, old, and probably quite horny, tried to run away. And communication between them was impossible, since she knew no Spanish and he knew no German. Ferdinand VII was furious, and called his sister-in-law and the oldest bridesmaid to instruct the bride immediately. After the two women's brief conversation with the young woman, the king returned to his room and prepared to consummate the marriage without encountering any resistance. However, Maria Josepha Amalia's fear was so great that while Fernando was penetrating her, she could not stand it and ended up defecating and urinating. The furious king cleaned himself up as best he could and did not touch his wife again for 8 days. Interestingly, the queen died 10 years later, childless, despite several attempts.